Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about the offseason storylines, a lot of different things going into this offseason, and we'll obviously break down some of the big time storylines as we get into next week, but let's talk about Ohio State. Let's talk about this 2024 team and how do they stack up to the other CFP champs has been a big time question as we head into the offseason and really as we just kind of measure these guys against each other, and it's kind of an interesting conversation because you do have the 12 team format, which has kind of informed a lot of these decisions, has kind of changed the way that we kind of look at the college football season and has changed some of the records that Ohio State broke throughout this year. But let's go ahead and jump in here. Remarkable season, obviously, a remarkable team by every mean, and the one big storyline that they did have at the very end of the year was they won 5 games against top 5 teams in the country. They also beat number 2, 3, 4, 5, 9, and 10. When you talk about the final rankings of this of the AP poll or of the CFP poll, remarkable stuff from this group. They were absolutely incredible really throughout the season. Obviously had the 2 blips against Oregon and against Michigan, and that definitely adds to this conversation just a little bit. They're also the second team in history, along with 2018 Oklahoma, that had a 3,000-yard passer, 2,000-yard rushers, and 2,000-yard receivers. Really remarkable offense, obviously, and Will Howard ends with the top QBR in the entire country. Really incredible team, and obviously a team that talent-wise can match up with a lot of the teams that we've seen in the past couple of years. There's no doubt about that. They're one of the more talented teams that I've ever seen. The question becomes, can they play that level of football continuously against some of these elite teams that we've seen in the past? And the other part of this, and the only real, I don't want to say issue, but the thing that I kind of have pause about when we talk about the most top 5 wins of all time and the 3,000-yard passer, 1,000-yard rusher, 1,000-yard receiver, the 12-team playoff helped them out a little bit. There's no doubt about that. They played the number 2, 3, 4, and 9 teams in the CFP tournament. Obviously beat them all. It was absolutely incredible to watch, but that obviously did help the top 5 wins where a 4-team wouldn't have given you that 5th top 5 win. And then Emeka Egbuka, Quinshon Judkins, and Travion Henderson all went over 1,000 yards on Monday night. So it wasn't necessarily like they were over 1,000 yards going into the CFP and then we're just adding on to that throughout the time. They got those extra couple of games. Now, they had to win those games, to be totally fair, and I think it is fair to say it's one of the most dominant runs we've seen because the 12-team playoff kind of necessitates that in a lot of different ways. So it's hard for me to say, without question, this is the best team that I've seen because I look around at the 12-team and I don't want to say it aided this team by any means because they obviously had to win more games, but it did kind of aid their resume just a little bit. It did kind of add to some of the majesty of this team and some of the incredible things that they did do. They ended up doing because of the 12-team playoff, not necessarily in spite of it, not necessarily they had to battle through it. More, they got a little bit of more games to kind of play around with things to kind of open up Jeremiah Smith and Emeka Egbuka and all those guys, and it obviously led to some really, really remarkable performances, but that's the big time question, how do they match up to the other CFP teams? Because they were great this year. They were the best team in the country this year, I really think, from start to finish. Had a couple of bad moments, no doubt about that, but you watch this team at their top level, they were the best team in the country. That was relatively clear, but how do they match up against the other teams? How do they match up against the other, what I consider the 3 best teams that I've seen in CFP era? And that starts with went one too far here, but that does start with 2019 LSU. This is a team that, it's the best team that I've ever seen. I'll be totally honest. It's a team that I think people are forgetting how good that defense ended up being. Now, didn't necessarily end up being world-beating or necessarily Ohio State's level this year, but you had Derek Stingley on the back end playing elite football. K'Lavon Chaisson was an absolute game wrecker off the edge by the end of the year, and Grant Delpit was an incredible center fielder at safety. So I think we talk about this team and there's so much, they just outscored everyone. They just made sure that they scored 50 points every game, and they did plenty of that. I'm not necessarily arguing that by any means, but their defense played the part that they needed to play. They were very opportunistic towards the back half of that season, and against a quarterback like Will Howard, who played incredible football throughout the last 4 games, but would necessarily struggle when you put him into tough positions. I think Dave Aranda could very well do that as the defensive coordinator. So I think this would be an incredible game. I think there would be a whole lot of points. If I'm being totally honest, I think there would be a ton of points. But at the end of the day, I do think there's going to be, I don't think this necessarily would go Ohio State's way. I think 2019 LSU is just that little bit more special. I think that 2019 LSU team would score a lot of points on this defense. As good as this defense is, as incredible as they are all across the field, this LSU team was just a little bit different. I think they would be a nightmare to guard for anyone in college football history, frankly. Then you got 2020 Alabama. The very next year, they were put on a very, very good run, and they obviously had an incredible offense as well. They had the Heisman winner with Devontae Smith at quarterback. They had John Mechie. They had Jalen Waddle for the early parts of that year. But Mac Jones was the guy running the show, and another incredible team. Najee Harris in that run game would be a little bit tough for Ohio State to fully stop, along with all this talent that they have on the outside. Steve Sarkisian and Joe Brady kind of went about it different ways when you talk about LSU and Bama, but both really, really aggressive offenses. Both offenses that will attack you in every which way, and both offenses that have speed that is just not able to really get prepared for. It's really one of those things where you play Devontae Smith, you play John Mechie, you can do everything you want to do. The reality is he's going to run around you every now and then. So I'd give the slight edge to Bama here. It'd be very, very close if I'm being totally honest, and I do think if they're both playing A-plus football, it would be an incredible game. But at the end of the day, I'd trust this Bama team just that little bit more, and really I trust Nick Saban a little bit more in a lot of different ways. But then you have the Georgia teams, and you can pick whichever one you want. I think 2022 was just that little bit better than that 2023 team because of that defense, and that's the big thing I want to talk about here. That UGA defensive line against this Ohio State offensive line, as good as they were, it's an entirely different conversation. That Texas defensive line did a really good job against that offensive line of Ohio State. They don't necessarily, they come close, but they're not necessarily what Georgia was in 2022 with Jordan Davis, with Jalen Carter, with all of those guys on that front seven. It was just going to be too much for this Ohio State team. So as good as they were, as good as Ohio State was, I think Will Howard's just having a nightmare in that game, if I'm being totally honest, especially with some of the guys coming off the edge that you would have with Nolan Smith, with a lot of these just ridiculously talented players. I think that offensive line would have a very bad day. Now, the outside matchups would be a really fun thing to watch. Jeremiah Smith against Keely Ringo would be two downright aliens going at it on the outside, so that would be incredible to watch. But again, I'd give the slight edge to 2022 Georgia. I'd lean towards that them in this in this respect. Definitely a really, really incredible team, and I think this Ohio State team is awesome. There's no doubt about that. I think they played 4 games that you could put them up against really anyone. But when I really get into it, when I really look at the entire season for this Ohio State team, I can't feel confident that they're going to beat a Kirby Smart, or they're going to beat a Nick Saban, or really they're going to beat a Dave Aranda. And Anthony, you make a great point that this 2020 Bama team was great at forcing turnovers. They were great at defense, and they were one of those teams that you could have all the ability in the world. They were going to kind of scheme you to death, and they did an incredible job throughout that year just kind of keeping teams at bay, and then that offense taking over, and I think that's how that game would unfold. So I'd give the slight lean to these 3 teams. Now, 2023 Georgia, we can have a different conversation. That's definitely a conversation to be had, but overall, incredible teams, all 3 that I'd give the slight edge over this Ohio State team. But why this team was special? Because there's a number of reasons why this Ohio State team was special, but the senior class was the reason, as far as I'm concerned. I've seen a lot of people go out there and say, they spent $20 million, so obviously you're going to win a national title. That is not how that works. I'll be totally honest with you guys, because if you want to know how that works, go down to Austin, Texas, go up to Eugene, Oregon, and ask them how that worked, because it didn't necessarily work in their favor, because they had to play this team, and they had to play this senior class, because you get the right guys in the building. It's not necessarily about getting all the most talented guys, although Ohio State did a great job of that. But I do think there's going to be moments where we look back on this team and we say, okay, $20 million in insane amounts of talent, that's why they won. They won because this team was together. They won because Jack Sawyer and all those leaders on that defense and really across that senior class were incredibly important to keeping that team engaged throughout that really, really rough patch after that Michigan game. So you can build a $20 million roster. You're more than welcome to, and ask your team to. They're absolutely welcome, but the reality is they're not all built the same. This one was built very, very specifically and was built with Ohio State guys. I know they got a couple of transfers that really helped out a ton in some big-time ways, but at the end of the day, the special part of this team, the bedrock of this team, was the senior class in a lot of different ways. So a very, very special team. This was the biggest reason for it. And then obviously, there were 2 absolutely game-changing talents on both sides of the field. There were Jeremiah Smith and Caleb Downs. Freaks, absolute freaks, both aliens in every single sense of the word. If Caleb Downs was not a freak, Texas is probably running a 4th and 4 instead of a 4th and 9 on that play. If Jeremiah Smith is not a freak, Notre Dame's probably getting the ball down 8 with about 3 minutes left in that game. So these 2 guys had a ton to do with what this team was capable of this year. Caleb Downs made them it looked like there were 4 of that guy on the field. He was absolutely incredible the entire year. And then Jeremiah Smith, if you want to cover him one-on-one, you're more than welcome to. It is not going to work out for you 9 times out of 10. He's a very, very good wide receiver, obviously, and it's one of those things that you have all the talent in the world, you have all the leadership in the world. Sometimes you just need absolute game changers, and this is what those guys are. They're incredible, incredible players, and frankly, if they could go in the NFL draft this year, they'd both be top 10 picks. And then you had true pent-up anger. This is the last key to this team because they were really talented the entire year. They had that ability the entire year. They needed a little spark. They needed a little thing that got them all engaged, that got them all locked in and had them pushing in the same direction. It was this moment. It was the Michigan moment where they tried to plant a flag in your field and people fought back. There's no doubt about that. And we'll talk about that Michigan game in a little bit more detail tomorrow, or a little bit more detail even later in the show. The people saying that game didn't matter, I don't know what to tell you. If you watched the aftermath of that game and came away thinking it didn't matter, I don't know what to tell you. But at the end of the day, this is what this team needed. This is what Ryan Day needed in a lot of ways. And you saw his pregame speeches before these games. He was a little bit mad. He would definitely wanted to get that monkey off his back, and he did in a huge way. So that was a huge piece of this team. You know, you can have the talent, you can have the leadership, you can have everything in place. Sometimes you just need a little bit of a spark to get everyone fully locked in, to get everyone pulling in the same direction, and that's exactly what happened against Michigan on that day. They've been able to really find a way to all pull in the same direction. It's a terrifying thing when this team does that, obviously. But my overall take on this Ohio State team was downright special, and these last 4 games are about as good as I've seen a team make. Now, you go back one more game, it gets a little bit sketchy. There's no doubt about that. But you look back at 2019 LSU, 2020 Bama, what they did was insane. Bama beat number 13 A&M by 28 points, number 3 Georgia by 17, number 22 Auburn by 29, number 7 Florida by 6, and then beat Notre Dame by 17, beat Ohio State by 28 to get the CFP. It was a team that if you put them in a 12-team playoff, they're probably tearing everyone to pieces regardless of what you put in front of them. And then LSU beat number 9 Texas, beat number 7 Florida by 14, number 9 Auburn, number 3 Alabama, number 4 Georgia, and then just rolled through Oklahoma and Clemson to a national title. So it's really hard to top those 2 teams. And really, that Georgia team back in 2022, I'd give the slight edge over this Ohio State team. I can't necessarily say this is the best team I've ever seen. I can say that they would give all those teams a good run for their money, especially if they're playing A-plus football. Now, we've seen them play C-plus football, and we've seen some of these other teams not necessarily do that. So that is kind of where the pause really comes in for me. But overall, incredible team, no doubt about that. An elite team, just not an elite year by any means. And I think you look back on that, even as an Ohio State fan, you got the national title. That's obviously the ultimate thing you want, but not necessarily the elite year because you got 1 out of the 3 goals that you put out there every single year. So that'll be an interesting thing to watch as we head into 2025, but incredible year for Ohio State. Not quite the team that 2019 or 2020 Bama, or 2019 LSU or 2020 Bama was, but incredible team nonetheless, and we'll see if they can build off that. And that's actually what we'll talk about next segment. We'll take our second break here. When we come back, we'll talk about Ryan Day and the incredible roster he's built, the incredible job he's done the last couple of years, and what the future could hold with him in Ohio State right after this. So stick with us.